The first hard frost came 3 weeks early that year, and Elias Brock was still on his knees in the mud behind his cabin, digging a hole that his neighbors had already decided was the dumbest thing they'd seen in a decade of frontier winters. Let me tell you about that hole, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why he dug it, why everyone laughed at him for doing it, and why, when the worst blizzard in 10 years locked an entire valley in ice, his family was the only one that didn't spend that winter afraid. This is the story of a tunnel, a simple, stupid, brilliant tunnel, and how it held one family together when everything else in that valley nearly broke. Let's start at the beginning, because you need to understand the world Elias Brock was living in before you understand why he did what he did. It was the 1860s. Deep in a mountain valley in the Northern Territories, the kind of place where the nearest town was a day's ride away in good weather and simply unreachable in bad. Elias had a cabin, a wife named Margit, 2 young children, a barn for the animals, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a smokehouse standing about 40 feet from the back door of the house. 40 feet doesn't sound like much. You walk 40 feet in about 15 seconds. But 40 feet in a whiteout blizzard, with winds strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet, with snow so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face, with temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. 40 feet might as well be 40 miles. That's the thing about the frontier that people don't always understand when they picture it. It wasn't the cold that killed people, not directly, not most of the time. It was the small mistakes the cold made possible. A man steps outside to fetch firewood, loses sight of his own house in a sudden gust of snow, wanders in the wrong direction for 30 seconds, and now he's disoriented in a whiteout with no way to find his way back. Every year, in every valley like this one, there were stories. A father found frozen 10 feet from his own front door because he simply couldn't see it. A woman who went out to the barn to check on the livestock and didn't come back. And when they found her in the spring thaw, she'd been circling in confusion no more than 60 feet from where her husband stood in the doorway, calling her name into the wind, wondering why she couldn't hear him. Elias Brock had heard those stories his whole life. He'd grown up on them. And in the autumn we're talking about, he'd already lost a neighbor to something close enough to that fate to be haunted by it. The man's name was Otto Reinhold, and he'd lived 2 valleys over. Early in the season before this one, a fast-moving storm had rolled in while Otto was crossing from his cabin to his barn, a distance he'd have told you, if you'd asked him the day before, was nothing. He'd made that walk 10,000 times. But the storm came in faster than anyone expected. The temperature dropped, the wind picked up, and somewhere in that short walk, he lost the path. They found him the next morning, 30 feet off course, frozen against the side of his own woodpile. 30 feet. That number stuck in Elias's head like a splinter. He couldn't work out. So when the leaves started turning that autumn, and the almanac and the old-timers and the particular sharpness in the morning air all agreed that this winter was going to be a hard one, Elias Brock did not spend his last good weeks of daylight doing what everyone else in the valley was doing. He didn't just stack more wood, though he did that too. He didn't just patch the roof and bank the walls with earth, though he did that as well. He decided he was going to solve the problem at its root. He was going to build a way to get from his cabin to his smokehouse without ever stepping outside. Now, you have to picture the reaction to this. Because this is a small, tight-knit valley, the kind of place where everyone knows. Everyone's business, where a man's choices in September become the subject of conversation at every kitchen table for miles around. And when word got out that Elias Brock was digging, not a cellar, not a new well, but a long trench connecting his home to his smokehouse, with the clear intention of roofing it over and turning it into some kind of underground passage, the reaction was not admiration. It was closer to pity, with a healthy dose of amusement mixed in. His nearest neighbor, a stubborn old Swede named Lars Halvorsen, who'd been farming that valley for 25 years, rode over specifically to see it with his own eyes, and then stood at the edge of the trench, shaking his head like he was looking at a man building a boat in the middle of a desert. "You're digging a grave for your smokehouse," Lars told him. "Or possibly for yourself, because you're spending the last of the good weather on a hole in the ground instead of getting your wood in." Elias, for what it's worth, had already gotten his wood in. He'd been up before dawn every day for 2 weeks doing exactly that. But he let Lars have his laugh, because arguing never once convinced a stubborn man of anything. And Elias had learned a long time ago that the only thing that actually changes a stubborn man's mind is being proven wrong by events he can't argue with. His wife, Margit, to her credit, didn't laugh, but she did ask him, more than once, whether this was really the best use of the time they had left before the ground froze solid and every task became 3 times harder. She had a list, the kind every frontier wife had that time of year, sealing gaps in the walls, rendering the last of the autumn fat for candles and soap, drying the final stretches of meat, mending clothes that would need to last through months of hard wear. Every hour Elias spent digging a tunnel was an hour he wasn't doing something on that list, and Elias understood that. He wasn't a stubborn man for the sake of being stubborn. He was, if anything, the opposite. A careful man, a man who thought in terms of consequences and probabilities rather than pride. So he sat Margit down one evening, with the fire going and the children asleep, and he explained it to her the way he'd been turning it over in his own head for weeks. He told her about Otto Reinhold. He told her that in every account he'd ever heard of someone freezing near their own home, it wasn't because they got lost far away. It was because the distance between 2 buildings in a whiteout becomes an unmapped wilderness. It didn't matter that the smokehouse was 40 feet away. In a bad enough storm, 40 feet was as dangerous as 40 miles, because you could lose the thread of the path in 3 seconds and never find it again. And here's the thing. He kept coming back to the thing that really convinced her. It wasn't really about him. Elias was strong and careful, and he'd probably have made that walk safely 9 winters out of 10, even without a tunnel. But it wasn't just him making that walk. It was Margit, going out for meat to cook the evening meal, while he was off checking trap lines or hauling wood. It was, God forbid, one of the children being sent to fetch something because it seemed like such a short, simple errand. The tunnel wasn't insurance for the one time a year Elias himself might get caught in bad weather. It was insurance for every single trip made by every single member of his family on every single day of a 5-month winter, any one of which could be the day the weather turned in the 60 seconds it took to walk from one door to another. Margit thought about that for a long moment, and then she asked him something practical, which was very much her way. She asked him if it could even be done, if he could actually dig and timber and roof a tunnel of that length before the ground froze, working mostly alone, with everything else that still needed doing. And Elias told her the truth, which was that he didn't know, but he knew what would happen if he didn't try. So the digging began in earnest. Let's talk about what this actually involved, because it's worth understanding just how much labor Elias put into this before a single flake of that winter's snow had fallen. The distance between the back of his cabin and the smokehouse door was a little over 40 feet. He wanted the tunnel deep enough that a grown man could walk through it without stooping too badly, which meant a trench roughly 4.5 feet deep and wide enough for a person to comfortably pass through, carrying a lantern or a hunch of meat, which meant something close to 3 feet across. Do the arithmetic on that, and you're talking about moving an enormous amount of earth, 40 feet long, 4.5 feet deep, 3 feet wide, that's over 500 cubic feet of dirt and rock that had to come out of the ground with a pick, a shovel, and Elias's own 2 hands, because he had no other labor to call on. This was a man working alone in the narrowing days of autumn, racing a clock he couldn't see and couldn't negotiate with the soil in that part of the valley. Wasn't kind to him either. The first foot or so was decent dark earth, workable, the kind of ground that gives when you push a spade into it. But below that, he hit a layer of dense clay mixed with stone, the leftover debris of some ancient glacial retreat that had scattered rock through that whole hillside like a hand throwing dice. Every few feet he'd hit a stone too big to lift out whole, and he'd have to work around it, or break it apart with repeated strikes, or dig beneath and around it to pry it loose. Some days he made 6 feet of progress. Some days, fighting a stone the size of a washtub, he made less than a foot. He worked from before first light until the light was gone, which in autumn gives you fewer hours every single day, a cruel shrinking clock ticking down toward the solstice. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back, he told Margaret once, felt like it had been rearranged by the end of most days. And every evening, Lars Halverson, or one of the other neighbors passing on the road, would glance over at the trench, now visibly lengthening week by week, and shake their heads a little more. There's a particular kind of loneliness in doing something everyone around you thinks is foolish. It's not dramatic, it's not a shouting match. It's just a quiet, grinding weight. The sideways glances, the jokes that aren't quite jokes, the unspoken question in every conversation of whether you've lost your good sense. Elias felt that weight every single day he worked on that tunnel. He wasn't a man who needed approval, exactly, but he was a man living in a small community, dependent on those same neighbors, for help in emergencies, for trade, for the basic social fabric that let an isolated homestead survive at all. Being thought a fool by the people you'll need to call on someday is not a small thing to carry. But he kept digging. By the time the trench was fully excavated, connecting a point just behind the cabin's back wall to a point just outside the smokehouse door, autumn was running out fast. The maples had gone from red to bare. Ice was forming on the edges of the creek in the mornings and taking longer each day to melt off. And Elias still had the harder half of the job ahead of him, because a trench in the ground is not a tunnel. A trench in the ground is a grave waiting for a roof. And without that roof, without proper timbering, the first heavy snowfall would simply collapse it flat, and all that digging would have been for nothing. This is where the real craftsmanship of the thing came in. Elias had, fortunately, some experience with timber work. He'd helped his father shore up mine tunnels as a young man back east before his family moved west. And though this was a different kind of project, some of the same principles applied. He needed a structure that could bear the weight of frozen earth and snow above it, something strong enough to hold for months without maintenance, because once the ground froze and the snow piled deep, there would be no fixing a failure until spring. He felled and split logs for the frame, upright posts sunk at intervals along both sides of the trench, and horizontal beams laid across the top to form the roof structure. He'd salvaged some timber from a fallen barn on his own property years earlier and never gotten around to using it, and now had found its purpose. Where he was short on milled lumber, he used split logs, flat side down, packed and wedged tight against their neighbors, so there'd be no gap for dirt to sift through. Over the roof beams, he laid a thick course of bark and brush, and over that, the excavated earth itself mounded back over the tunnel's path and packed down hard. By the time he was finished, if you stood in his yard and looked at the ground between the cabin and the smokehouse, you'd have seen little more than a long, low, earthen ridge, like a change in the land itself. Nothing that screamed tunnel unless you knew to look for it. Inside, it was a different world entirely low. A tall man had to duck his head walking through it, narrow and dark, lit only by whatever lantern you carried in with you. The walls were raw timber and packed earth, and the air inside had a particular smell, damp wood and cold soil, that Margaret said reminded her of a root cellar, which in some ways is exactly what it was, just longer, and with a very specific purpose. He built a door at each end, heavy wooden doors, hinged and latching, one set into the back wall of the cabin itself, where he'd cut through, and one at the smokehouse. These doors mattered more than people might guess. They weren't just there to keep animals out. A tunnel open at both ends to the outside air becomes a wind tunnel, and a wind tunnel in deep winter is nearly as cold as being outside. The doors let him seal the passage at both ends, trapping the relatively stable temperature of the earth itself inside, which, even in the coldest months, stays well above the brutal extremes of open-air winter wind chill. He finished the last of the timbering, and the earth, mounding with what he later reckoned was less than a week to spare before the ground began to freeze hard enough that further digging would have been impossible. Margaret told the story for years afterward that, on the day he drove the last peg into the smokehouse end door frame, the first real snow of the season began falling before he'd even finished cleaning his tools. He'd made it. Just barely, but he'd made it. Now, I want to pause here and talk about what didn't happen next, because it's tempting to imagine that the moment the tunnel was finished, all of Elias's neighbors suddenly understood, and the jokes stopped, and everyone nodded in recognition of his foresight. That's not how it went. Not yet. For the first several weeks after the tunnel was completed, the winter was frankly unremarkable. Cold, yes. Some snow, yes. But nothing that tested anyone's arrangements particularly hard. People still walked between their cabins and their barns and their smokehouses the ordinary way, bundled against ordinary cold, and if anything, Elias's tunnel became something of a running joke that persisted even after its completion. Lars Halvorsen apparently told anyone who'd listen that Brock had built himself an expensive way to duck his head in the dark, and that he could have saved himself 6 weeks of digging by just walking outside like a normal man and putting up with a little cold same as everybody else. Elias didn't argue the point. He'd learned that arguing about it accomplished nothing. He simply used his tunnel morning and evening, ducking through that low dark passage to fetch meat from the smokehouse without ever putting on his coat, while his family stayed warm and dry. And he let time make his argument for him. Because Elias knew something that his neighbors, for all their years in that valley, seemed to keep forgetting winter after winter. An easy start to a season tells you nothing about how it ends. The valley had a long memory of hard winters arriving late, catching people who'd let their guard down after a mild November, storms that built quietly in the mountains to the north, and then came down all at once with a violence that made the whole autumn's calm feel like a trick. And that's exactly what happened. It came in late December, a few days after the solstice. The kind of storm that old-timers afterward compared to only 1 or 2 others in living memory. It didn't build gradually. That was what made it so dangerous. The morning it started, the sky had that strange yellow-gray heaviness that people in the valley had learned over generations to be wary of, but the wind was calm, the temperature was cold but not extraordinary, and there was nothing in the first few hours that screamed catastrophe. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up to a steady, driving force, and snow began falling. Not the gentle drifting kind, but a hard, slanting, wind-driven snow that filled the air completely. By evening, visibility in the valley had dropped to almost nothing. And by the second day, the storm had settled into a pattern that would hold for the better part of 4 days. Sustained winds strong enough to knock a person off balance. Snow falling and blowing so thick that a man standing at his own front door could not see his own barn 30 feet away. And temperatures cold enough that exposed skin could suffer frostbite in a matter of minutes. This was the storm that, in the years afterward, people in that valley simply called the Christmas storm. And they used it as a marker for time. The way you'd use a great flood or a great fire, things were dated as before it or after it. And this was the storm that turned Elias Broka's tunnel from a subject of ridicule into the single most important structure on his homestead. Let me walk you through what those 4 days looked like, first for the Broch family and then for their neighbors, because the contrast is really the whole point of this story. For Elias, Margit, and their 2 children, the storm was, in the most literal sense, an inconvenience rather than a crisis. The wind howled around the cabin day and night. Snow piled up against the walls until it reached the windowsills and had to be occasionally cleared to let in what little daylight there was. The cold outside was brutal, the kind of cold that made the nails in the cabin walls sweat frost on the inside. But inside the cabin itself, life continued in something close to its normal rhythm. Meals were cooked with meat fetched from the smokehouse. Venison, salt pork, strips of dried meat that Elias would duck through the tunnel to retrieve whenever they needed it, returning in under 2 minutes. Not a snowflake on his shoulders, not a shiver in his hands. The children, who might otherwise have been kept from the smokehouse entirely during a storm like this, could actually be sent. Under supervision, at first, until they'd proven they had the knack of it to fetch small items themselves, learning quickly to duck their heads at the low spot near the middle where a support beam hung slightly lower than the rest. Margit later said that the strangest thing about those 4 days wasn't the storm itself, which she'd lived through versions of before. It was how normal everything felt inside their home, while the worst weather in a decade tore at the walls outside. There was no anxious calculation every time someone needed meat for supper, no weighing whether the trip to the smokehouse was worth the risk, no bundling up in every scrap of wool they owned to make a dash through blinding snow, no counting the minutes until whoever went outside was expected back and starting to worry if they were a minute late. The tunnel had simply removed an entire category of danger and stress from their lives, at exactly the moment when that category of danger and stress was at its most severe for everyone else in the valley. Because here's what was happening at the same time, just a few miles away, at the homesteads that had laughed at Elias's tunnel. Lars Halverson's cabin and barn stood about 60 feet apart, further than Elias's cabin and smokehouse, and Lars had no covered way between them. When the storm hit, Lars made the decision, like most homesteaders would, to rig a guide rope, a line strung between the two buildings that a person could hold onto to keep from losing their way in the whiteout. This was a genuinely smart precaution, one that had saved lives across that frontier for generations, and it's worth saying clearly that Lars was not a foolish or careless man. He was doing exactly what experienced people did to manage exactly this kind of risk. But a rope line is not the same as a roof over your head. Twice during that storm, Lars had to make the trip along that rope to tend to his livestock, because animals don't stop needing care just because a blizzard is raging. And each time he came back half frozen, his beard and eyebrows caked in ice, his hands so numb it took him 20 minutes by the fire to be able to feel his fingers properly again. On the second trip, the wind was strong enough that he later admitted, quietly, to Elias, that there was a stretch of maybe 10 seconds where he genuinely lost his sense of which direction the rope was pulling him, where up and down and forward and back all seemed to blur into the same screaming whiteness, and he simply held on and prayed until his hand found the corner post of the barn. 10 seconds. That's all it takes. That's the gap between a story you tell afterward with a shudder and a story that gets told about you at your funeral by neighbors shaking their heads about how it happened so close to home. Other families fared worse in smaller ways. The Kesslers, a young couple with an infant, a few miles further up the valley, had their woodpile positioned about 25 feet from their cabin door, uncovered, and by the second day of the storm, the drifting snow had buried it under nearly 4 feet of snowpack, meaning that every trip for firewood, which is to say, every trip to keep an infant from freezing to death in a blizzard, involved not just braving the wind and cold, but excavating fuel from beneath a snowbank, with numb hands in the dark, with the wind screaming loud enough that a mother inside the cabin couldn't hear whether her husband was calling out or not. Young Axel Kessler told the story afterward, and it became one of the defining stories of that storm in the valley's collective memory of the third night when he went out for wood and the wind gusted so hard it staggered him sideways into a drift, and for a moment, just a moment, he genuinely couldn't find the cabin wall he'd been standing beside seconds before. He described it later as the most frightened he'd been in his entire life, more frightened than any animal encounter, any accident, anything, because it wasn't a threat he could fight or run from, it was simply the world disappearing around him. The ordinary geography of his own home turned into a featureless, roaring white nothing. He found his way back by dropping to his knees and crawling in what he hoped was the right direction, until his hand hit the base of the wall. He'd been perhaps 15 feet off course. 15 feet. In a valley that already carried the memory of Otto Reinhold 30 feet from his own woodpile. Now, word of these close calls didn't travel during the storm itself, obviously. Nobody was visiting anybody during 4 days of that kind of weather. But it traveled fast once the skies cleared, because in a small valley community, the stories of a storm like that get told and retold at every gathering for months afterward, compared and measured against each other, the frontier equivalent of war stories. And when the storm finally broke, and it broke suddenly, the way these things often do, the wind dying down over the course of a single afternoon, until an eerie, heavy stillness settled over a valley buried in white, the scene that greeted everyone who stepped outside was staggering. Snow had drifted in places to the height of a man's shoulders. Familiar paths between buildings were simply gone, erased, replaced by an unbroken white surface that bore no resemblance to the ground beneath it. Roofs groaned under the accumulated weight. Some outbuildings had partially collapsed. It took most families the better part of 2 full days just to dig out proper paths between their own buildings to reestablish, physically, with shovels, the ability to get from their front door to their barn without wading through snow up to their waist. Elias Brock had a bit of digging to do himself, clearing the entrances to his tunnel where drifting snow had piled against the doors at both ends. But it was a task measured in an hour, not 2 days, because the tunnel itself, protected under its earthen roof, had stayed exactly as it was throughout the entire storm. A stable, navigable, weatherproof channel between his two most important buildings, entirely unaffected by 4 days of the worst weather that valley had seen in a decade. When Lars Halvorsen came by, on snowshoes, because the ordinary road was impassable, to check on his neighbors in the aftermath, as was the custom after a storm like that, he found Elias's family in about as ordinary a state as you could hope for. Well-fed, warm, rested, no frostbite, no near misses, no stories of crawling blind through a whiteout praying to find a wall. Elias didn't make a show of it. That wasn't his way. He didn't stand there and say, "Well, look who was right after all." He just offered Lars a cup of coffee and a plate of the smoked venison that had never once required anyone in his household to step outside to retrieve, and let the older man look around at a household that had weathered the Christmas storm without a single frightening moment worth telling later. Lars, to his credit, was not a small man about it. He stood in Elias's kitchen, looked at the door in the back wall that led down into that low, dark tunnel he'd mocked so thoroughly back in October, and he said something that Elias remembered for the rest of his life, and that got repeated around that valley for years afterward, becoming something close to a local proverb. He said, "I laughed at a man for digging a hole in good weather. I won't laugh at him again." And he didn't. In fact, Lars Halvorsen spent a good part of the following spring and summer digging his own tunnel between his cabin and his barn, 60 feet of it, longer than Elias's, and by the time the next hard winter came around, 2 years later, 3 more families in that valley had done the same between their own key buildings. What had been a subject of ridicule became, within a few years, simply what a careful homesteader in that valley did before winter, the same way you'd stack extra wood or bank your walls with earth. The tunnel stopped being Elias Brock's strange eccentricity and became, quietly, a piece of local wisdom, passed down the way all frontier wisdom was passed down, not through lectures, but through stories told at gatherings. See, about the year the Christmas storm came and taught everyone a lesson about distance and cold that no one in that valley ever forgot again. But I want to bring this back to the Brock family, specifically because the tunnel's value wasn't just measured in the dramatic terms of a single storm. It was measured in the accumulation of 100 small things across that whole hard winter, the kind of things that don't make for dramatic storytelling on their own, but that add up to the difference between a winter that breaks a family and a winter that doesn't. It was measured in the fact that Margit never once had to make the calculation, every single day, for 5 months, of whether it was worth risking a trip through bad weather to get supper started, because the trip was never really a risk at all. It was measured in the fact that the 2 Brosch children, 7 and 5 years old that winter, grew up with a fundamentally different relationship to their own home during winter than most frontier children of that era did. They weren't taught to fear the space between buildings the way so many children in that valley were, quietly and without anyone meaning to teach it, simply by absorbing their parents' tension every time someone had to go outside in bad weather. For the Brock children, winter was cold and dark and sometimes frightening in the way storms are frightening to anyone, but it wasn't associated with that particular, specific fear of the short walk that swallows people. It was measured in something Margit said years later when she was an old woman telling this story to her own grandchildren, trying to explain to them why their great-grandfather's tunnel mattered so much. She said that the thing people forget about hard winters isn't the big dramatic dangers, the once-in-a-decade storms. It's the grinding daily weight of small risks, repeated over and over for months on end. Every single trip to the woodpile, every single trip to the barn, every single trip to fetch food carries a small risk in bad enough weather. And most winters, most of those small risks resolve safely. But repeated enough times across enough days, across an entire family, the odds catch up with somebody eventually. That's simply how probability works, whether anyone in a log cabin in 1860-something understood it in those terms or not. Elias understood it well enough in his own way. He looked at 40 feet of ground between his cabin and his smokehouse, and he saw not a short walk, but hundreds of repetitions of a small gamble made worse in his mind by every story he'd ever heard of that particular kind of tragedy. And he decided, in the last weeks of one autumn while his neighbors spent that same time on other tasks and mocked him for his choice, that he wasn't going to make that gamble even once, if he could help it. There's something worth sitting with in that, because the whole story of Elias Brock's tunnel is really a story about a particular kind of wisdom that doesn't get celebrated much in his time or in ours. It's not the dramatic wisdom of the hero who rushes into danger and saves the day through courage and strength. It's the quieter, less glamorous wisdom of the man who looks far enough ahead and takes seriously enough a danger that hasn't happened yet that he's willing to do weeks of unglamorous, unrewarded, mocked labor to make sure it never gets the chance to happen at all. That's a harder kind of wisdom to admire in the moment because it doesn't look like anything. There's no drama in digging a trench in October. There's no story in a quiet family eating a normal supper during a historic blizzard. The whole point of what Elias built was to make sure nothing dramatic ever needed to happen. No rescue, no near miss, no story to tell afterward with a shudder. And there's a strange kind of unfairness in that, if you think about it. The people who prepare well enough often end up with the least exciting stories to tell, because their preparation worked. Meanwhile, the people who underprepared get the dramatic tales of survival against the odds, the crawling through the whiteout stories, the close calls that make for gripping telling around a fire. But ask yourself which one you'd actually want to have lived through. Ask which family you'd rather have been. That Christmas storm, the one crawling on hands and knees through a screaming whiteout, praying to find a wall. Or the one calmly fetching smoked venison through a quiet, dark tunnel and getting on with an ordinary evening. Elias Brock knew which one he wanted to be, back in October, when nobody else could see the value in what he was doing, and he was willing to be laughed at for 6 weeks to make sure of it. I think that's really the heart of this whole story, if you want to draw a single thread out of it. It's not really about a tunnel. Tunnels in the end are just dirt and timber and doors. It's about the willingness to do the hard, boring, unrewarded work of preparing for a danger that everyone around you has decided to simply live with. Because that's how it's always been done, because a rope line has always been good enough before, because everyone's 40-foot walk to the smokehouse has always worked out fine in the past. Past performance, as it turns out, is not a guarantee of future safety, whether you're talking about frontier, winters, or anything else in life. The fact that a risk hasn't caught up with you yet doesn't mean it isn't real. It just means you haven't rolled those particular dice enough times yet. Elias Brock looked at a small, repeated, easy-to-ignore risk, and instead of accepting it the way everyone around him accepted it, he spent 6 weeks of hard, mocked, lonely labor engineering that risked out of his family's life entirely. And when the worst storm in a decade came, the storm that tested every arrangement in that valley, that turned near misses into cautionary tales, and cautionary tales into changed behavior for years afterward, his family was the one household that didn't have a single close call worth telling. They just had supper. Warm, ordinary, uneventful supper cooked with meat that never once required anyone to step out into the cold. And maybe that's the real ending of this story. Not a dramatic rescue. Not a near tragedy, narrowly avoided. Just a family, warm and fed and together, while outside their walls, a blizzard did its worst and simply couldn't reach them. The tunnel is still there, by the way, or at least the memory of it is, passed down through that valley's stories the way these things get passed down. The specific cabin and smokehouse are long gone now, worn away by more than a century and a half of seasons. But for years afterward, homesteaders in that valley dug their own versions of Elias Brock's tunnel before winter set in, and when their children asked why, they told them the story of the Christmas storm and the man who spent his last good weeks of autumn digging a hole in the ground that everyone laughed at, right up until the moment it saved his family from ever having to be afraid. He didn't build it because he knew a storm like that was coming. Nobody could have known that. He built it because he understood something simple and unglamorous and easy to overlook, that the distance between warmth and food in a hard enough winter can become the most dangerous 40 feet in the world. Andy decided quietly, without an audience, without anyone asking him to, that his family was never going to have to find that out the hard way. That's the whole story. A man, a shovel, 6 weeks of ridicule, and a tunnel that turned out to be the smartest thing he ever built.